All right, so the ban list that was announced at YCS Anaheim actually went into effect that very day, meaning we have officially entered a new format. And for today's video, I've decided to go over some topping deck lists that are viable for this new format. We're going to be talking about Ryzu, Malice, and many different other decks, tech cards, important engines, versions of decks, so you guys can be up to date with everything that's going on, and it's going to be a little easier to make your choice for which deck you're going to be running for this format. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, and of course share all of your ideas and thoughts in the comments as well. We're not going to be covering every single deck in the format, so if you have some important observations or something you would like to share, feel free to do so in the comments. So hopping right into it, first we have the top 32 list from YCS Anaheim. That's Memento, actually. And of course, I only chose lists that were not affected by the ban list. And this event was played with crossover breakers being legal. So I would say this kind of list is a good representation. What we're also going to be doing is I'm going to be choosing a couple tech cards from every single list and explain why I believe they are good for this format. So going over the list itself, I would say it is fairly standard for Memento. If you're playing Memento, feel free to share your thoughts about ratios and the rest. But this is the Memento lineup. I mostly want to focus on non-engine, actually, because I believe cards like Ultimate Slayer, Karma Cannon, and which other card do we want to pick for this list? Maybe Ogre. We can talk about those. I think they are really good for this format, and overall I would say this hand trap lineup is fine, but it's just this deck in its entirety is just a little bit odd because of the ratios, but I believe this has to do with siding patterns. So Ultimate Slayer I think is really, really good because you're able to run Meteorologic Aggregator. And this is just a great card. Being able to negate a card is super important because you're pushing into a board and you're baiting out and forcing interruption, and that's always great. Since by then you have already stopped your opponent with some of your hand traps as well. You can also go for a board breaker approach with just board breakers. You don't have to pair everything together, but for this particular deck, this person decided to do that, which is fine. I would also say Ghost Ogre is strong in the next format, so that's something to keep in mind. And I have been seeing a lot of Charmies in the main deck, and that goes for Purulia as well as Fuvalos. So I believe both of those are going to be very significant for this format, so that's also something to keep in mind. As well as if your deck is able to run Thrust with targets post-siding, I would definitely suggest that. Karma Cannon is a great target. Threatening Roar is here because of Tempai, I believe, so this is something that can comfortably be DDG or something like that for the next format, in which decks like Yubao and some other graveyard-focused strategies are still going to be seeing play, at least in my opinion. So that's something to keep in mind. The most important card is obviously going to be the barrier, so probably not much we have to say about this except for Ryzu and Xyz monsters, as well as Calling Fusion is fine against some strategies. So let's move on and talk about Malice. So this is Gabriel's list from top 32. He went undefeated in Swiss. This is something that's really important to note because his run unfortunately ended in top 32, but he did lose to the eventual winner of the event. I believe this list was a winning list. I think this list was just amazing. So let's hop into some of the tech cards. And obviously, you know, it's Malice, so let's talk about that as well. This deck is going to be super strong in the next format. And as for the Malice cards, some of the ratios I want to talk about is actually the cat, because people are running 2, 1, 3 as well. But for this deck, I believe you're kind of struggling with your starters and your names and access to those. So I believe a ratio of 3 is fine. Something else to note is Code of Soul. You can play it, but you don't have to. Of course, you can send it with terahertz, but there's a couple issues with that. Number one, you're very rarely getting to terahertz because you're getting hand trapped. And number two, sometimes sending aggregator is a little better because you're playing it due to Ultimate Slayer already. So you might not decide for Code of Soul, If it comes up, sure, but I have seen lists cut this card. Let's talk about other tech cards and engines. Number one, I want to focus on engines. It's going to be Sky Striker. Keep in mind that Malice can be played with different engines. We're going to see another list a little later. But Sky Striker is a great engine for multiple different reasons. It's providing bodies as well as being able to break boards, because the Widow Anchor and the extra draw off of Engage is going to make it so you actually draw into your breakers or your plays and starters if that's what you need. As for tech cards, Shifter is going to be really important. If you can play Shifter in either main or side, I would still suggest you do it. Obviously, Tempai is going to fall off, but there are decks that still lose to Shifter, so this is just a new Shifter deck. It is definitely not a toxic abomination like Tempai was, so keep that in mind. Some other tech cards are going to be Vicious, with Fiendsmith being completely untouched by the ban list. Fiendsmith, Kashira, Fiendsmith, Magical Musketeer, Fiendsmith, pretty much anything else is just going to be present in the format. That's a fact. So Vicious are a really good way of dealing with those decks. Not to mention that in a deck like Malice, they actually serve as part of your engine and extenders as well. So I would say they are super important. There's also Book of Eclipse, which cards like Book of Eclipse, Ultimate Slayer, all of these, they're here to deal with Raizio, but a lot of times, most times actually, you're gonna need two breakers to deal with that deck. So that's important to note. Another card is Talons, but we can't talk about Talons right now. Maybe save it for later, because in this deck, it is not as amazing. That's why it's only played at 1, and it is a good thrust target, but we'll talk about it later. There's also Lancia, great against Malice, obviously, and also Dominus Impulse. This card is still good, and if your deck can run it, I would suggest you do. And on that note, you can also play Dominus Purge in a deck like Kashtira, Fiendsmith, or something like that, if that's what you want to be doing. So with that, let us move on to the next list. So this one is incorporating Kashtira cards. I would say by themselves, Kashtira cards are still going to be a good engine, but I would say they are a little inferior to Sky Striker in Malice. They provide bodies. I just think Sky Strikers are a little better, but you can play Kashtira in other decks as well, as you have seen in the last format. There's also Droll, but keep in mind this deck was still built for Anaheim, and I assume Jeff also expected fire decks, even though there weren't as many represented, but it is a valid card to play against those decks in particular. I'm not sure how well it's going to perform in the next format. I wouldn't say it's bad, but just keep in mind that some of your hand trap ratios might have to change and go along the lines of Valor Impermanence, Nibiru, Ogre, Ash, Charmies. Those are some of the best ones in my opinion. So here we have 2 copies of Talons, and there's also Droplet, again, board breakers. You don't have to go for an all board breaker approach. Malice by itself is just a deck that can play board breakers extremely well, so that's something to keep in mind. You don't have to play board breakers if your deck is not suited for it, if that makes sense. There are decks that just function way better with hand traps. I would say Raizio is a good example of that. But Talons is a great way of dealing with Detonator, because all we're trying to do is deal with Detonator. Let's be real. So Droplet also is just another way of trying to deal with that card. As for everything else, we have talked about most of the tech cards. But for example, this list is playing only 1 cat. All right, moving on to another Memento list. This one, I just wanted to show it to you so we can talk about some other tech cards like Crossout. When you're playing many different non-engine, you can definitely afford to play Crossout. And also, we're moving into a format that's going to be a little more focused on 3 to 4 decks, I would say. Raizio Fiendsmith, Malice with different engines, and then there's going to be like Fiendsmith decks, Yubao, Memento, stuff like that. But if you're playing one of the top decks, I would say Crossout is a really good card, because you can also effectively use it in the Raizio and Malice mirror match. So that's something to keep in mind. And let's move on to Voiceless Voice. So I want to cover this deck because I think it's going to function quite well in the next format due to multiple reasons. And I keep talking about this, but I just really want to drive home the point that Voiceless is not in a bad spot, even though it's not the greatest deck of all time. I've always been talking trash about Voiceless, actually. But for this format, I don't think it's trash. So let's talk about it. It can grind really, really well. It doesn't really lose to Charmies. It can play cards like Dominus Purge, as you can see here. It can play either hand traps, a couple board breakers. You can play Fenrir, Talons. There's just a lot of flexibility with this deck, but mainly its ability to grind is super important. As for the actual ratios, I would say that's very standard for Voiceless, and the Nadir package in here is also strong. So yeah, everything else here, you can see a copy of DDG, but I do not see Thrust, that's actually interesting because you have like one-offs that could work extremely well with Thrust. So maybe there's something I'm missing, but since you're playing all of these at one already, why not play Thrust as well? I don't know, I assume they're gonna hand trap you, so why not do it? But to each their own. Of course, you can do whatever you like. Let's move on to Raizio. Let's talk about all of this because you can play Fiendsmith, you can play Raizio, and just a lot of hand traps. The main difference is the fact that without Fiendsmith, your grind is gonna be much worse. That's pretty much it. So I would say Fiendsmith overall, like I talked about before, is going to be one of the most important engines of this format. If your deck can run it, I would suggest you do. Lacrima is an insane card. It is so strong. It deals with hand traps so easily. And for this deck, the Raizio lineup is always going to be the same, pretty much. This deck in particular is not playing plugin or the trap card though. And of course, our winner of YCS Anaheim said it is not needed because this deck is mainly focused on utilizing Fiendsmith to further your grind. But we do have other versions where, of course, there is plugin, but this deck is not playing Fiendsmith and is also maining Crossout like we have talked about before. And also comparing both lists, this one is not running Desires, but the other one is, because obviously in the previous one, you have one-offs that you actually don't want to banish and you want to have access to all of your Fiendsmith cards all the time so you can grind as best as you can. And I just don't think Desires is needed in that deck, but it is needed in this one. So other than that, Metal Tronos is a tech card we can talk about. I'm still a little indecisive when it comes to Metal Tronos. I would say it has potential. If you want, you can test it. But for this deck, I also want to focus on the hand trap lineup. I think these hand traps are literally the best ones. If you can incorporate those into your deck, if you're playing a hand trap deck, I would definitely suggest you do so. Moving on to another list, this one is very similar. It's playing One Small World though, which is interesting. And another card we can talk about is Ghost Bow. I don't think Ghost Bow is bad at all, actually, but I don't know if I would put it in my top 5 or 6 list. I would say it's fine, but again, keep in mind this deck was made for Anaheim and Ghost Bow is really strong against some fire decks, which are definitely going to be trickling out of the format right now. So let's move on. We also have another Fiendsmith version, but this one is playing plugin. So this is just a little different theory, and it's only one tracked, which I'm personally not a fan of. It is also a 44 card deck. I played 2 tracked in Yubo at 44 cards. I just think tracked is insane. It's just such a great extender. And if you compare this to the winning list played 3 because obviously the winners saw value in tracked, which I think is just a very, very strong card. And then we also have Sanctum, to get Lancia. It just is what it is. So with that, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed. If you're still watching, thank you very much for sticking until the very end. Make sure to give it a like and drop a comment. It really helps the channel. And hopefully this video was helpful in letting you know which kinds of tech cards and engines people are playing, and it gave you a bit of an idea for what you can pick up for this format. So again, hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.